just now as we were talking, Holly and Leslie, there are many situations, and it becomes ever more complicated with different discourses, different, what shall we call them, positions that seem to be taken by organizations based in the magnetic north, where you find yourselves having to negotiate in the Caribbean, to negotiate often through very uncertain ground or uncertain waters. I sense how you make this meaningful, how you make this exchange, despite whatever the rhetoric is around collaboration, cooperation, decolonization, de-imperialization, whatever, that nevertheless it's a very, from the point of view of the organizations or artists, cultural professionals in a place like the Caribbean, negotiating that, navigating around that can be very problematic. Can I ask what you know, for some initial thoughts on that point? Holly, would you like to comment?
Sure. David, thank you. I feel that as people working in the Caribbean as cultural practitioners, there's a kind of weariness and I guess also underlying cynicism with regards to the approach of working from the Caribbean outward. And because there's always been, and there's been a deep and complex history that has allowed us to say some things that are meaningful and to make partnerships that are deep. That's always our intention. We're looking for moments where we are able to express some kind of truth about our reality. And oftentimes, I find when these negotiations happen, and once we are able to settle on some kind of discrete understanding of what the intention and output will be, I'm saying that the trust factor and how we deem value and how we ascribe value to what we're doing is oftentimes not registered as similar or in parallel. And I see this as something that is very much operational within our field. We're now moving into a position where we're speaking more frequently about reparations. We're, using that word decolonizing as perhaps a strategy, but I'm wondering if we're at this point, 60 years after post-independence, most of the Anglophone Caribbean countries, how are we working to equalize and bring equivalence to this field? Meaning there's still some kind of suppression and or oppression within these partnerships. So I'm always very cautious about how we speak about engagement, how we speak about equity, parity, because these things function differently within the context of how we work. And because we come from a space that has been diminished, and because we're working to figure out what healthy sustainability means for our spaces, perhaps we need to go back to the drawing board and see what the real parallels are rather than making assumptions about these partnerships. And for our local context, and in particular, I'm speaking about my memory and my work from the Bahamas, it was clear then that the partnership, while very fruitful, still had that underlying current of mistrust and cynicism. So we weren't able to move beyond that. And in retrospect, I feel that we should think about rules of engagement in a different way. We should think about these opportunities to bring truth telling to the fore in more succinct and tangible ways, rather than hustling to sign a contract that might be meaningful for the next 6 months, but we're thinking in long-term ways about the survival and the space of the Caribbean in which we can really think about moving from sustainability into thriving action. So these are some things that I'm thinking about now as we think about what partnerships mean, what collaboration is, what healthy exchange is, and how equanimity could become something to the forefront of our minds and move away from this parachuting and ticking of boxes approach. It really doesn't work for our local space. It doesn't function in a really productive and formidable way.
Lesley,
True.
from your context with the performing arts and community arts engagement, does some of that strike a chord?
Yes, all of it strikes a chord. I am 100% in alignment with some of the nuances Holly has highlighted, and I would probably add some concrete examples from experience, just to kind of move it from the space of theory and ground, you know, some of what she's highlighted in reality, based on my perspective and experience working in Jamaica in education, culture, and the performing arts. When it's a constant pursuit of balance, this, you know, this question of partnerships. Is it fair? Is it balanced? Is it right? Is it worthwhile for those of us in the Caribbean? Following from our preliminary conversations, oftentimes in this world of international development, which is the context in which this conversation is grounded, ideas, funding come from what David so graciously refers to as the magnetic north, North America, Europe. The ideas and funding travel from those spaces to the global south, in this context, the Caribbean, you know, and that begs the question of, okay, so what does balanced collaboration look like in a context where oftentimes the prompt, whether it's a concept, an idea, or a grant, comes from, you know, Europe, North America? What does balanced cooperation look like? And for us, we navigate it in the same way as we navigate any personal relationship. Are we aligned on values? So in practical sense, are we after the same outcomes? How do you, the partner, perceive your involvement? Is it a favor that you think, you know, we should be really happy to receive money, we should be happy to receive technical expertise, people in the global south should be happy to receive? Or are you perceiving that you could also learn something, benefit, values in another way? So that goes right back to what Holly said about perceiving and defining value. How do you think we're going to go about this venture of ours? Is it that we're going to go into a space and say, all right, this is what we're here to do? Or are we going to take it from a more inquisitive perspective? This is the idea we have in mind. Are you, the community, in agreement, in alignment with what we're proposing? And if so, how do you think we should go about this? You know, the expectations, how far are we going to be able to go? How fast? One of my major pet peeves working in this space is that there's this perception that the Caribbean is cheap, like it's cheap to get things done. You know, it doesn't need to cost that much. That's what it costs in the UK. Why is it costing the same in Jamaica? You know, all of these dynamics that are constant reminders of how far we have to go when it comes to truth telling and building trust in these spaces where we work. So we've done well in a lot of respects, and have our ways to go in a lot of respects as just how we perceive ourselves relative to the rest of the world, and spaces where we venture to insert ourselves, whether for work or play.
Holly, can I ask about the, you know, that framing in terms of development and what that really means, you know, from your point of view?
Yeah, absolutely, David. From the context of being now, I'm operating as an independent curator and a cultural worker, still framing and keeping the Caribbean very close to me. Development is fraught. Development recalls a history of underdevelopment. Development recalls scarcity. And, something that Lesley-Anne mentioned was very interesting for me, this alignment with values, moving from a space where we always assume a lack and trying to articulate a sense of the power that we inhabit as Caribbean intellectuals, as Caribbean artists, as Caribbean people who are looking in many ways beyond development. I think that our countries are right now in the throes of like economic upheaval with COVID. But the wonderful thing about working in the creative industries is that we're always attached to this imagination, and this imagination is very fluid, and it allows for us to keep our dream space very open. And that means that we can come to a table and we can occupy a seat at the table where we're speaking in very fair terms about this Caribbean that we want to that we're envisioning. We want it to manifest in a very particular way. So my thoughts around development are centered around, again, issues related to not underselling, issues related to being very self-aware. So as a cultural worker, as an artist in this space, not ascribing a value that is less than what we desire for ourselves. I think when Lesley-Anne commented on the Caribbean being a cheap space, the Caribbean being a place that you could easily dismiss because if it's cheap, it's not worthy. So really using our language intentionally as, operators in this field to speak about the complex history, to speak about how guilt manifests within this language as well, because there's a lot of that floating around always. And then when we think about alignment, what is this alignment within a sort of a cultural codex? Is the alignment going to be truth-telling, or is the alignment going to be speaking about where we are versus where we want to be, and then articulating that theory of change without diminishing? And it might sound really sort of heady, but in practical terms, and bringing it back to this on the ground support where we see our communities evolving, and I see them changing and really taking a different stand with regards to how they're empowering and how self-aware they're becoming. And this investment is really and truly based on a very like equitable brotherhood, sisterhood exchange. Anything outside of that is oftentimes seen as suspect. But this brotherhood, sisterhood can't, manifest if the income disparity continues. So we've been doing a lot of work recently to actually put a value to our labor. And I think as Caribbean people, because we've not done this, we've not looked at the books, we've not looked at, the budgets, we've not, calculated what it means to work for 3 hours on a project, because we're so impassioned about moving our space forward. We oftentimes take ourselves away from that number, and that's changing now because of this conversation around, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and because we are moving towards not only decolonization, but moving towards a deeper understanding about ourselves and what it really means to think about progress in our space. And development is at times very nasty because it is, taken by this economic framework, and because we don't have the tools to ascribe what we're doing, because at times it's so intangible, we have to develop a different system to speak about that, like that will to make ourselves become equivalent. And I don't think it's money only, you know, it's all different kinds of investment that go beyond the financial. I liken it to the 8 types of capital that's founded in permaculture, which includes, you know, living capital, material capital, cultural capital, experiential capital. So we're thinking about a wholeness, a holistic approach to reinforcing our space and to making it possible.
Thanks, Holly. Lesley, I heard you murmur agreement there on a point. I'd be interested to hear also a little about, you know, your experience of working wider communities. A lot of your work in the performing arts is very much at the grassroots in some quite difficult spaces in places like Kingston. And how does this play out somewhere like, you know, Parade Gardens, for example, in Kingston, or in Montego Bay?
Well, the number one way in which it plays out is, who are you? What do you want from me? Why are you here? And these are questions we should be comfortable answering, regardless of the social dynamics at play. But in a context where you're talking about a former colonial power and a former colonized nation, and the lasting dynamics that this history gives rise to, which, let's keep it real, it's often not cute. It's often very uncute and extremely uncomfortable. And the first bridge and the first challenge we cross with these young people anytime, and this is regardless of where the so-called foreigner is from, like this dynamic between white skin and black skin, as we've been, you know, cultured to talk about it. These are not my preferred terms, but in the interest of clarity, we'll use these terms. You know, once that white skin, black skin dynamic comes to play in the community-based spaces where I work, you are tasked with immediately and clearly addressing, who are you, why are you here, and what is it you want from me? Because there is an automatic assumption that if you know the history, you can understand and empathize what gives rise to this assumption. This assumption that you're here to take something from me. And the exchange in this dynamic is not likely to be fair or equitable. So negotiating these assumptions and dynamics, it takes a lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of love, and a lot of communication, which leads us right back to where this conversation started about truth telling. There has to be a willingness to acknowledge and speak the truth, to state it clearly and plainly, and to express vulnerability, to show that, look, you know, we don't necessarily have all the answers either. and we're open to standing up in the fire to have the conversations that we need to have to ensure that everyone is experiencing a level of comfort as it relates to what are we doing here? What's the dynamic here? You know, what are we getting at? So this whole issue of truth telling is critical to building trust, because without trust as a basis, you're not going to get outcomes that are worthwhile in any venture, in any venture, whether this is social dynamics, you know, business, office space dynamics. It's a critical ingredient to the foundation of productivity and efficacy. So openness and a willingness to be vulnerable and a willingness to hear things that you don't like, but to receive them. And this happens on both, you know, all from all perspectives. I don't want to polarize and say both ends of the spectrum, but everybody at the table has a responsibility to be willing to do this. And once there's that willingness, magic can happen.